toothbrush?
I mean, it's not The Secret of Monkey Island or The Curse of Monkey Island, but it works, right? Welcome to my review of Tales of Monkey Island for PC, Mac, Wii, PlayStation 3, and iOS. This is an adventure game by Telltale Games and published by LucasArts that was originally released throughout the year of 2009 for PC, and it later saw release across other systems. And it generally got a pretty good reception, especially after how, of course, Escape from Monkey Island was kind of horrible. But let's face it, by the time this thing came out, we weren't really expecting any really big, high-quality adventure games anymore, and we certainly weren't expecting a new Monkey Island game, especially not with Ron Gilbert and Dave Grossman working on it together. Ron Gilbert had more of a supervisory role in this particular one. He wasn't really hugely involved with the project other than just kind of giving some creative direction. But Dave Grossman was actually spearheading the whole thing because at this time he was working with Telltale. And they produced a series of 5 episodes that ultimately went on to become the biggest success for Telltale at that particular point up until they made Back to the Future the game. So, obviously they did something right, and maybe it was just relying on brand recognition or something like that. But the real question here is, does this redeem the series after the complete mess that was Escape from Monkey Island? How does Telltale handle things, considering they are certainly not LucasArts, even with the creative input of Ron Gilbert and Dave Grossman? So, at the risk of sounding incredibly cliche, let's delve into this thing and see if we found some treasure, or if it'll be walking the plank. Well, as far as presentation goes, it's a bit of a mixed bag on a lot of fronts, namely in the visuals department. On one hand, it has a very cartoony art style that really does fit the game quite well. Things are grossly over-exaggerated, and of course it has a lot of really weird, really goofy animations and such like that going on. But then there's the problem with it, and that's that, frankly, it just doesn't look that good, in terms of graphical fidelity anyway. It certainly looks like a Telltale game, and what I mean by that is, it's got a respectable budget to the visuals, but not really enough to make it actually look very good. In fact, it looks rather dated even for when it came out. And that really shows when you get to especially the animations, namely when it's doing the lip syncing or what passes for lip syncing in this, which is just horrible. And we'd already nailed that stuff years before that, so that's not exactly pleasant. And it also doesn't help that some of the character movements are, even though they're exaggerated and kind of cartoonish, they still look odd. And not in the good way. But this is a game that doesn't really need extremely good visuals or anything like that, luckily. Now, if the sound design were weak, on the other hand, then that would be a pretty significant problem, considering that every line in this game is voice acted, and on top of that, you're dealing with a series that has a very well-established musical style. Fortunately for them, they had Michael Land doing the music for this one. You may remember that name from the previous Monkey Island games. So, it does sound in the same vein as the other Monkey Island games, but there is one problem, and that is the actual Monkey Island theme. It's unfortunately a fairly weak rendition of it, and it certainly doesn't have the same kind of iconic sound as, of course, the Secret of Monkey Island version and the Curse of Monkey Island version, which was basically just reused for Escape. So I guess that counts as well. But here it's just kind of there, and it feels like a throwback rather than a fully integrated part of the game that really feels like it should be there, which is kind of odd. As for the rest of the sound design, the sound effects do their job, and that's about what you would expect. This series has never really been known for great sound effects. They've always been just, it works, and that's enough, and this one's no exception. But where it does really excel is the voice acting. For the most part, it's actually rather good. And a lot of voices from the previous games do in fact return. Alexandra Boyd is back as Elaine, and of course Dominic Armato for Guybrush, and Earl Bowen for LeChuck, so it feels like a good reunion, and they all still do great jobs, and the new cast that shows up for the new characters actually also does a very, very good job. You got a lot of likable characters here with their own personalities, and it really does come across in the voice acting, so kudos to Telltale for being able to pull that together. And that's something they've really always been good at, so they do deserve some praise for that, at least. But what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this opens up with Episode 1, the launch of the Screaming Narwhal, where Guybrush has been assembling the Cutlass of Cthulhu, which is a voodoo artifact that's supposed to be able to kill LeChuck once and for all. And he goes to stab LeChuck with it, and instead of actually killing LeChuck, it turns him human. And from there, Guybrush accidentally sets off the gunpowder that's on the ship, and he gets sent flying out into the ocean, where he eventually drifts onto Flotsam Island, which is an island where the winds are constantly blowing into the island, so no ships can actually escape. So the plot starts out with him having to find a way off of Flotsam Island so he can get back to Elaine. And along the way, he discovers that he has unwittingly unleashed the pox of LeChuck by stabbing him with the Cutlass of Cthulhu, because he screwed up during the creation of the artifact and accidentally broke the root beer bottle they were supposed to use. So he substituted some fizzy grog instead, and suddenly the curse is in his hand, very Evil Dead-esque vibe there. And he has to find a way to stop the pox, and even worse, stop it from being unleashed across the entire Caribbean. And that's where the problems really begin, because unlike in the previous games where the story was relatively coherent, if completely wacky, this one just kind of goes all over the place, and it doesn't really come together until the final episode. But even then, there's a lot of stuff that just feels incredibly contrived, like the Marquis, for example. His whole thing just feels incredibly contrived and really, frankly, pointless to the game, which is kind of weird considering that he takes up a considerable amount of the game. The character's just completely ridiculous, and frankly, he's annoying as hell. Whereas other new characters like Morgan Le Fay actually feel like they belong in a Monkey Island game. And several of these characters are very much amusing and do feel like they belong in a Monkey Island game, which is where they managed to succeed. But the overarching plot that ties all these characters together is fairly weak, and even worse is the whole subplot with the Marquis and trying to get the pox from Guybrush so he can live forever through weird mad science. That's just, again, a complete waste, and really doesn't belong in the game. I don't remember a single bit where that actually was really important to the game, other than the fact that it explains where Guybrush gets a hook. And that's pretty much it, actually. Everything else is centered around LeChuck and voodoo, so they weren't really consistent with that, and it does show as you continue throughout the game. There are also a few things with the characters that try to flesh them out, and some of them work better than others, but ultimately it just kind of feels like a really mixed bag in that. Again, some of it works fairly well, some of it just plummets, and the kind of big reveal that they throw in toward the end of the season is just really contrived, honestly. It doesn't feel like it's been there since the beginning, and it's just kind of a, well, we're going to throw that in there just to kind of throw a big plot twist at you. But the absolute worst problem with the writing is actually not in its story or its characters. It's the fact that while this game is silly, while it is ridiculous, it's nowhere near as funny as the previous games in the series. Even Escape from Monkey Island was funnier than this. And it wasn't that funny. I laughed only a few times throughout the entirety of Tales of Monkey Island, and I was frankly appalled at this fact. That's kind of the point of Monkey Island. It's supposed to be this wacky, offbeat pirate adventure that has a heavy emphasis on comedy, and while they try to do that with Tales of Monkey Island, most of it just falls flat. And there were numerous gags where I was just sitting there going, really? You're doing this? This isn't remotely funny. Why are you doing this? And yet, when it does the credits sequence where Murray's skull is floating down the sea, and he's actually pointing out things on the credits like they do in Whose Line Is It Anyway, that actually got me laughing, because it was ridiculous and fourth wall breaking, and I'm like, holy crap, this is actually a funny gag. I mean, it doesn't really feel like Monkey Island very much, but it's funny. And most of the other fun moments that I had in this thing were basically just throwbacks to the older games. For example, There is a manatee mounted on a wall where you can go at one point, and if you insert an object into the manatee, then it does a rendition of the Pirate Life for Me song that was in Curse of Monkey Island.
A pirate I was meant to be, trim the sails from the sea.
Yay!
And while I did get some nostalgia from that, it wasn't really all that funny, and really barely any of the jokes in this thing actually had me eliciting anything more than a heh. And look, I get it, comedic writing is hard, especially when you're the 5th game in a series, and especially when it's going to the hands of a different developer than who originally made it, and when they've been out of the groove for years and years by that point, in fact. So I do get that there were some issues with it, but when you predicate pretty much your entire series on humor, and the humor isn't that great, you got a problem. And the other elements of the game don't really compensate for that, especially not the gameplay, and this is the other really big problem that this thing has. It is a point-and-click adventure game, but you can move around with the keyboard. You can also move around by holding the right mouse button and the left mouse button at the same time, and just kind of moving the mouse around to drag your character around. It's an awkward system. I never liked it when Telltale made this system, and especially when it changes the camera angles on you to something that's horrible where you can't see where you're going, it gets incredibly irritating. But you can get used to it after a while, and about the time you get to the middle of Chapter 2, you've probably gotten really used to it, and it's not really that big of a deal anymore. It's still kind of annoying, though. But apart from the movement being really awkward, it's pretty much what you would expect after having played really any point-and-click adventure game. You find various items that you can use to interact with other items or things in the environment. You have various puzzles you need to solve, and solving these puzzles is going to progress the story for you. Here's the problem. The puzzles range from incredibly easy to the point of being completely trivial to not really that hard, but requires a lot of backtracking and trial and error and gets really, really annoying. None of the puzzles in this game are particularly well designed. There are a few that are okay at best, but by and large you're dealing with a lot of really mediocre puzzles, and they rely way too much on backtracking, especially in the last chapter of the game, the 5th chapter. It has absolutely ridiculous amounts of backtracking, and even better is that they reuse locations from the 1st chapter in the 4th chapter, verbatim. So you're dealing with very, very small environments that are all very tightly put together to the point where there's basically no variety to them whatsoever. This in itself is kind of tiring, especially when you have to do a lot of backtracking through these environments. Luckily, the individual chapters are relatively short, so you're not spending too horribly much time in there, but it does wear on you, and you do notice. But like I said, it kind of gets away with it because the game's length is relatively short. That said, it would have been so much better if they had designed unique environments instead of just reusing the same ones over and over and over again, and just saying, okay, well, we're just going to have a bunch of puzzles where you have to go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. That's just tedious. It's boring. And you don't do that. Adventure game designers learned that quite a long time ago, and it feels like they're just kind of stuck with it. Unfortunately, this creates a problem, as you would expect. It means that most of the gameplay is actually pretty boring. And you don't really feel like you are an intelligent puzzle solver when you're going through this thing. You feel like you're just kind of trying everything until it works. And it doesn't really punish you for that. In fact, that's pretty much all you can do, but that's beside the point. Some of the puzzles are relatively logical and they are relatively easy to figure out, but that's the problem. They're relatively easy to figure out. I never once felt that my brain was being taxed during this thing. I felt that way in the older Monkey Island games, but not here. And I guess that's the ultimate problem that Tales of Monkey Island really has. Even though it tries, and oh does it try, to give you this sense of being a Monkey Island game. It's like, hey, Monkey Island's back. We're throwing in a few references back to the old games so you feel right at home, and we're going to do a bit of things our way, but don't trust us, it's a Monkey Island game. And then you play it, and you just go, eh. And that's the problem. it's just incredibly underwhelming. It's not bad, don't get me wrong, it's certainly no escape from Monkey Island, I hated that game. This one I'm just kinda ambivalent toward. I don't feel like I completely wasted my time by playing it, but it's just disappointing. Especially considering that Dave Grossman and Ron Gilbert were involved in the production of this, and Michael Land. And it was made by Telltale, who normally put out some pretty good stuff. But this one, not so much. If you can pick it up on sale, it might be worth it, but overall, it's a very underwhelming game, and that nets it a 2.5 out of 5. And with the closing of this review, so too closes my 2015 retrospective on the Monkey Island series. I hope you enjoyed it, and thanks for watching.